I was asked to come and provide an update on select pieces of legislation that passed during the 83rd legislative session that are of interest to this group generally. These are primarily in the area of energy efficiency, combined heat and power, water, things like that. At last year's CATEE conference, I provided an update sort of on what had passed, and this is a presentation, sort of an update on where things are. And the cycle is when the legislature convenes, passes legislation, typically the effective date, if it's not specified otherwise, is beginning of the fiscal year, in this case September 1st of 2013 for a lot of this. So the laws go into effect, then there is an implementation period that follows after that. So agencies that have to develop rules, things like that, to implement legislation, that happens. You know, a lot of work happens in the interim. Then typically what happens is during that time you realize, okay, this is working really well, or maybe it needs to be tweaked, and then that may tee up some opportunities for refinement during the next legislative session. So anyway, so we're in the interim right now. The 84th convenes in January, and we're sort of at the tail end of a lot of this implementation. So what I'm going to cover today are some updates again on some of the energy efficiency and renewable energy and water-related legislation. So I think if you're not aware of the volume of legislation that typically we see during a session, this is a graph that shows that. And of the bills filed, which are the blue bars, you'll see that almost 6,000 bills were filed in the 83rd legislative session. And only a fraction of those in the red, passed. And what you can't really see is there's a green bar that's down at the very bottom that shows bills that actually passed but were then vetoed later by the governor, so that's a very small fraction. So there's a huge volume of bills that are filed, legislation that is considered in committees, goes through the process, and again, only a fraction really kind of make it across that final finish line. So in the 83rd, we saw the volume about equal to the 82nd legislature, a little less than the 81st. So that's kind of the overall picture volume-wise. This is a graph that I think is pretty interesting. The Texas Tribune publishes different analysis of legislation and legislative sessions. And what you see here is this, each box represents the number, essentially the size, the number of bills filed in each of these major categories. So if you look at the top left, education bills, there was more education House bills filed than any other type of legislation. Just under that, taxation, more House taxation bills. And then the darker sort of orangish color are the Senate bills. So if you kind of follow it from the top left to the bottom right, you'll see kind of the activity within each of these major categories. So the ones I've circled are the ones that are probably of interest mostly to this group. And those are the first one on the left side on the bottom, utilities, environment, again, utilities, environmental quality, water, oil and gas, and so forth. And so you'll see that, compared to some of the kind of major categories of education, taxation, and so forth, there's a relatively small volume still, but still quite a few in the areas of energy and water and environmental issues. So an update on some of these bills that we discussed at the CATEE conference last year. One that you heard about yesterday in one of the breakout sessions, and one that is really interesting and provides a new model that has a lot of opportunity to implement energy and water improvements in commercial and industrial buildings was Senate Bill 385, and that created the Property Assessed Clean Energy Financing structure. And essentially this allows commercial and industrial property owners to make improvements, investments to their facilities, and then to repay those investments over longer term through an assessment on the property. This is a voluntary assessment. If there is a existing mortgage on the property, there has to be consent provided by the mortgage holder because this is considered a senior lien and gets that priority in the case of a bankruptcy. Or foreclosure. So this is all, the structure is not entirely new or unique to Texas. We took in this bill some of the best aspects of PACE legislation in other states and pull them into a Texas-specific bill. One thing that's very different about ours is in other states, they have done a top-down sort of state-administered PACE initiative where everything goes through a single state entity. In Texas, we don't do that. We enable local governments to create local programs, and so what this does is it allows local governments, whether it's a municipality or a county or a combination of those, to establish local programs that follow this general model, and then building owners, commercial and industrial property owners can participate in those local programs. So over the last, during the interim, we've worked with a number of stakeholders. Our office has been involved in the technical standards piece of this, but then certainly others, the Mortgage Bankers Association, others have contributed to putting together what's called PACE in a Box. And what that is a set of guidelines, sort of model practices that local governments can pick up and use, and that can be their program. And so the idea is to create more uniformity across the state. So if you're a mall owner, commercial property owner, and you have malls all over the state, you don't have to necessarily do business, 1,200 different ways across different cities. So there's more uniformity to the basic program. So this was developed, it's voluntary, but we're certainly encouraging local governments to look at this and use that as their model. As far as activity, the no local PACE program has yet emerged. There are several that are sort of on the edge of moving forward. The Lower Rio Grande Valley Development Corporation actually voted to be the regional administrator in the valley for Cameron, Hidalgo, and Willacy counties for PACE, and that's beginning to move forward. And then also there's been a strong indication of interest from Williams and Travis counties, City of Paris, City of Longview, City of Waco, and then in the greater Houston area, individually through the cities, but then through the COG as well, and then here in DFW also through the COG. So keep your eye on PACE. Another energy efficiency bill that passed, and the goal here, Senate Bill 700, was to harmonize and make a number of the reporting requirements that are applicable to state agencies and public higher education. Over the years, different requirements have been passed, and those have gotten out of sync. And so the idea was to create a common platform where agencies and higher ed could report how they're managing energy and water resources and costs so that those could be reviewed and evaluated more easily, certainly by the legislature, but by the Legislative Budget Board. And our office was tasked with creating that platform and doing that common reporting. So what we did was Energy Star Portfolio Manager, which is a benchmarking tool that's been out for years and is widespread in its use across the country in all segments. We took that and used that as our reporting platform. So the way that it's working is individual agencies in higher ed report their information into that platform, but then they share the information with us. Then when we do reporting back to the legislature, we can extract the reports as needed. So that's all rolling out. The first biennial report, which is a summary of all these activities, is due by December 1st of this year. That's in the final stages of being produced now, and will be done before December 1st. So that's more to come here, but I think this will provide some meaningful kind of benchmarking information so that agencies in higher ed can understand, hey, how are we doing compared to our peers, and what are some opportunities to maybe do better? What are some best practices that may be happening in one sector or one university that could be translated to our operations? So it helps with I think the transparency aspect of it as well. And Senator Hager, who's now Comptroller-elect Hager, who's our new boss, was the author of this, and so I'm sure that this will be something that he'll be watching as well, and probably have some other ideas about how to continue to refine this. The next bill, this is one that Senate Bill 533. The idea here was that agencies in public higher ed enter into energy savings performance contracts, but there's no real summary, or there's no common review of how are these projects performing. So they enter into long-term contracts. The projects appear to be working for the owners, for the universities and the agencies. But is there anyone collecting data on are they performing as expected? And so This creates a structure where our office collects information from agencies, and the Higher Ed Coordinating Board collects information on performance from higher ed. And this sets a structure up, but the reality is none of these projects, none of these contracts have been executed since it passed, so there's really nothing to report. So as these do flow through the system, we'll be capturing this performance information to make sure that that we as taxpayers and public sector entities are getting what we think we're paying for in these kind of projects. Next bill, House Bill 2049 on combined heating and power. This one, the idea here is that if you have a combined heating and power plant, generally it's going to be natural gas fired. It's going to produce thermal energy, steam, as well as electricity. Many of these projects, they may provide electricity for the site where they're located, but they may have excess thermal energy and steam that they pipe off to a neighboring facility. You see a lot of this in the Houston Ship Channel industrial complex, where you have steam customers that are buying power from a CHP plant. Well, this would allow that steam customer to also buy electricity, surplus electricity produced by the CHP plant as well. And so this again sets up a structure. We are not aware that any CHP projects to date have utilized this yet. There's a little uncertainty as from the owners of these CHP plants about how exactly this would work. And most of the development for CHP has been focused on providing power for baseload operations, for baseload service. We have abundant low-cost natural gas. These projects economically make sense for the owners, and so they've been designing the project to serve baseload, not to provide excess power, which would then be exported. So that's been the focus. But I think this sets up a nice structure that over time it gives flexibility to owners and operators of CHP plants to give them another offtake for their excess power. The other CHP bill, for a number of years now, a critical government facility has been defined as basically a public building that could be used as a place of shelter in the event of a natural disaster. So schools, public hospitals, things like this. And there's been a requirement that when these critical government facilities are constructed or there's major renovation, that they consider combined heating and power as part of that project. The idea is that if there's a hurricane, you lose grid power, and you need a place of shelter, this would be a standalone power plant that could supply power to continue operations in that unit. And so this has been a requirement for a while, but there hasn't been any guidance on how these evaluations should be conducted. So last session, House Bill 1864 was passed that charged our office with developing guidelines on how exactly consulting engineers, owners, designers of these critical government facilities should be conducting these feasibility studies. So we developed the guidelines, and they're posted on our website for the use of these different entities. On renewable energy, Chapter 313 modifications, this is actually something that is operated in the Comptroller's office across the hallway from us. The idea, Chapter 313 is really incentives tied to the Texas Economic Development Act. And this originated as, if you think about it, if you own a home and you pay property taxes, you understand the significance of paying property taxes. Well, if you have a manufacturing facility you're trying to locate to the state or trying to build here, and in that manufacturing facility you have work that involves jobs, there's kind of a disincentive if there's a high property tax rate to make that investment in your manufacturing plant to facilitate that job creation. So this allows school districts to grant up to a 10-year exemption on the local M&O share of property taxes for those types of facilities to encourage the development of that. There certainly have been a lot of participants in this program, some manufacturing lines, expansions and new construction along, we see really unprecedented investment in chemical and refining right now along the upper Gulf Coast. And then also there have been a lot of wind farms that have taken advantage of this because they qualify as well. And the one thing that's come up is the idea originally was to link these incentives back to job creation, but was anyone really doing the accounting on the job creation? So this bill not only reauthorized this section of the Texas Economic Development Act, but then also charged the comptroller with receiving and information about job creation and then providing that information back to the legislature. And that first report under this new legislation will be sent to the legislature before the 84th. On water, the big water bill, obviously last session, funding really a down payment of sorts for the state water plan. In 2011, water was certainly front and center for everyone. Then it rained a little bit, and it wasn't, the highest priority, but it's still, if you look at reservoir levels, if you look at consumption, if you look at growth, water is a very high priority for the state. So the state water plan was developed, and implementing the state water plan takes time and money, and it's incremental. To get that started, looking at really the windfall in oil and gas severance taxes that have come into the state treasury, there was a proposition that the voters approved in November of 2013 that allowed the use of $2 billion of the rainy day fund, the economic stabilization fund, to really get the state water plan moving. And so this is now being implemented. The Water Development Board, it has a lead on this. The SWIFT funding for the State Water Implementation Fund, $800 million in this first round. These are low-interest loans, deferred loans, board participation. They're not grants, they're loans. And so the first round of that's open. Applications are due February 3rd. The projects have to be designated and fit within the state water plan. And then water service providers, public water systems, are those that are eligible and would actually do the work. So this is really going to get the state water plan moving. Tax issues, this is one we talked about a year ago, the pollution control property ad valorem tax exemption. This is if you are, an example of this, if you are making an investment, say to a plant that is done for pollution compliance purposes, the investment required for that, and these are huge, in many cases, very large investments, millions and millions of dollars, the cost of that is exempt from your ad valorem tax purposes. And so there was some tweaks that were done to this, and the TCEQ has the lead. The rule updates were effective at the end of August. They've been doing training seminars. In fact, I think there was one earlier this week or last week, a couple of more in the next two or 3 weeks, and then an advisory committee meeting for this in December. The TCEQ is revised, and they have their application form, instructions, and guidance. That's all updated, and all that's there on their website. TERP, and I'm going to kind of end here and set up Representative Isaac a little bit to talk more about this. I could probably put 30 slides together with updates on TERP. There's been so much activity. At the highest level, what's happened with TERP, and you may have read about this, it's not exclusively applicable to TERP, but in the state we have many fees and dedicated sources of revenue that were intended originally for a specific purpose. And all of the funds collected through those revenue sources have not been reallocated or reappropriated as originally intended. TERP is one of these, where the fees collected through vehicle registrations and inspections and things like this, not 100% of that has gone back into the TERP programs. And since TERP passed in 2001, the balance of unappropriated funds, is pretty significant. And so there's now a sort of a deliberate move to, incrementally increase the allocation of funding to the TERP programs. You don't want to do it all at once. It's like, the snake swallowing a mouse. That would, create administrative problems and things like that. And so this is kind of a systematic approach to allocating more to TERP, creating some complementary new programs like the natural gas vehicle programs that could use TERP funds, because obviously the emissions profile of natural gas is going to be favorable for vehicles. And so there's a lot of changes to TERP, new grants, new grant rounds, increased frequency, new program areas, higher levels of funding. And this seems to be, something that is working well, will continue. And I would, in terms of speculation of what would happen, I think, there would be another incremental push probably considered this next legislative session to continue to kind of build on that base that TERP has created over the years. So I'm going to stop there. We could, go through the thousands of bills that passed, but somebody's phone's going off, and I guess that's my hook. And I know Representative Isaac has some time constraints, so we'll probably transition over to the legislative portion of this, and then I'm happy to entertain questions later or stick around, and we'll be around through the morning. So thank you.